So hello everybody, do take a seat. We have a very packed session. So for those of you who weren't here first thing this morning, I'm afraid I do have some disappointing news in that the Minister has unfortunately had to cancel his visit to us today. I think we can probably make some allowance for that. He did say there's a lot of parliamentary business on at the moment. So what he has done though is he's actually recorded a short video for us. So I'd just like to kick off the session by letting you see that video.
Hello everyone. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you here in Manchester, but thanks to the wonders of modern technology, I am with you by video link. You're meeting in another momentous week for the world of pensions with the introduction of the Pension Schemes Bill in the Queen's Speech. Now, here is the bill. I hope you now have copies of it. We believe very strongly that the bill shows how we will ensure that there's nowhere to hide for any reckless boss who puts workers' retirement savings at risk and reforms DB. We will bring pensions into the digital age with the pensions dashboard to give savers plain facts at their fingertips in one place, online. And we're going to reform pensions by way of collective defined contributions. We have consulted extensively with the TPR and various partners whilst formulating the bill. And various high-profile cases have shown that DB does need reform, whether it is the BHS or Carillion case. We need confidence in the pension system, and we need a better structure for the regulator taking this forward. Doing nothing, in my view, is just not an option. So that's why we have consulted, and that's why we've brought forward the bill. Now, there are greater protections for members, which include new civil and criminal sanctions to punish bosses who willfully or recklessly harm company pension schemes. The introduction of the dashboard will help people further reconnect with their pension pots by making it easier to see their pensions information in one place. And we want people to be able to better plan for retirement, not just with confidence, but knowing that their pension savings are protected. And this bill will provide more options for employers by introducing CDCs. These schemes will ensure that people can save adequately for retirement and better predict their income in later life. And the bill provides appropriate legislative and regulatory framework for the new CDCs, which enable contributions to be pooled and invested to give members a target benefit level. This has benefits for both members and employers. All of these measures ensure that savers can be confident that their pensions are protected and that the regulator will take action if pension savings are put at risk. And at a time when Parliament is divided, some would say, on other matters, I'm pleased to say that we are taking forward the bill's reform with cross-party support and general consensus amongst parliamentarians and stakeholders alike. The consensus is vital to the bill. Lastly, a word on the PLSA. My apologies I can't be with you, but I support what the work you are doing to make better planning and saving towards retirement so that we can see the developments that you've done so that savers can think about their future and the retirement they want. We have transformed savings for retirement for millions of people, and the next challenge is to make it easier for them to engage more with their pensions. That is something I very much want. So I thank you for listening. I hope you have a great conference. My apologies that I can't be with you, and I hope I'm with you next year when we will also be able to take forward the bill as a finished product in the House of Commons.
Great, well that was the message from Guy, and this session was meant to be me interviewing him. As he's not here, that would have been a really bad session, so what we've done instead is I've been able to get all of my colleagues here who are chairs of the various committees who also sit on the PLSA Policy Board as well. So we've got a really distinguished panel at relatively short notice to debate some of the things that we heard there in the pensions bill. So just to introduce, so Greg McClymont, Greg's chair of the Master Trust Committee, Carol Young, who is chair of the DB Committee, Laura Myers, chair of the DC Committee, and Nicola Mark, chair of the Local Authority Committee. So a fantastic panel to have here today. And just to explain how we're going to run the session now. So the panel are going to discuss their initial thoughts and reactions to the bill. And I'm going to ask some questions really covering 5 main topics. So we're going to look at CDC, the dashboard, TPR powers stroke DB regime, transfers, and then the 5th one is things that are not covered in the bill. So those are going to be our sort of 5 main topics that I'm going to talk to the panel about. Then after that, we're going to open to the floor. So that isn't just questions this time, it's those of you who may have read the bill in more detail than any of us have on the panel, then you can actually also state your views, your reactions to the bill as well. And then finally, at the end, we've got a PQM Distinction Award to give out. So that was going to be given out by the Minister, but don't worry, Richard Butcher has stepped in and he's going to give out that award instead, so hurrah. So let's kick off the session. What more can I say but hurrah? And talk about CDC to start off with. So the bill will provide a legal framework for CDC. Now, so far, there's been relatively little interest in CDC issues, apart from, of course, one or two notable exceptions, such as the Royal Mail scheme. So really, I'd like the panel to think about, what impact on pension savings is likely to follow on from that new CDC regime? And in what ways do you really think it's going to address saver needs? So, Laura, can I just start with you on that?
So, as you were saying there, Emma, there's not been much traction on CDC yet. I don't think this bill particularly changes that. It is talking about having connected employers that are able to access CDC, so it's probably going to be likely that it expands from the few notable that we've seen so far. But really, in my view, if we think about it, many corporates have already moved to kind of a DC pension provision. It's unlikely that they'll want to take a step back to a more DB risk perspective, which CDC ultimately is. There may be more opportunities out there that maybe certain people will want to start thinking about CDC, possibly more union, paternalistic employers. We actually do have a client of ours that is considering this a large DB scheme. So I think there will be some uptake, but no, I don't think we're going to be seeing a plethora of CDC schemes in the future. It's not really going to be as widely adopted as DB and DC are. It's interesting, it does address some members' needs. I mean, there's pros and cons with CDC, having more, as we've talked about earlier with the retirement living standards, and having more kind of understanding of your target, which CDC does give for members, could be a real positive, but there's so many different hurdles and obstacles to think about with this type of pension scheme.
And then, Greg, I know that you're quite interested in talking about how CDC could play a role in DC decumulation.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I think that distinction between CDC as an accumulation phase and potentially a decumulation phase is important. For the Royal Mail's purposes, one can see precisely why CDC could be a good option. But I suppose I would argue from a master trust perspective, for the very large scaled master trusts, the benefits which CDC appears to provide in accumulation can be achieved by scale. The pooling dimension is achieved by the economies of scale that very large master trusts can achieve. You can hold assets a long time, you can redistribute them amongst your different member cohorts. It means you don't have to sell down assets. There's some of the benefits that CDC appears to provide. I think master trusts that have got huge scale and accumulation can achieve the same efficiencies. The question is in the retirement phase and whether sharing longevity and investment risk in the retirement phase is a more efficient way to proceed. I draw a distinction between pooling and sharing. If you think about large master trusts, they're pooling different employees into a large-scaled entity, but what they're not doing is sharing the risk in a single bucket, for want of a better phrase. That brings its own challenges, of course. How do you ascribe property rights in a collective shared enterprise of that kind? And clearly that would need to be worked through in the retirement phase. But I do think it's at least an open question about whether CDC has a role to play in the retirement phase. I think the intergenerational stuff, finally, the intergenerational challenges and accumulation of CDC are really significant. How do you ensure that younger generations are treated fairly in the down moments in a broad accumulation phase?
And then I have got a question that's already come in that says, what exactly is CDC? Which I think is actually a very good question from the audience. So would anyone like to explain that? What exactly is CDC?
If anyone else wants to take it, but
I think you can go for it, Greg. Yeah. We're giving it freely to you as a question.
The best way to understand it is to look at the Dutch system. Yeah. So the Dutch system is now CDC, but it's CDC through the accumulation phase, which means individuals don't have any individual units or property rights. You have a share of the whole fund, but to bring that to life, there's no way to take your pot out at retirement because there are no pots. There's just an overall fund in which you enjoy a share, and that takes you all the way through retirement as well. So it's a distinction between pooling, which scale achieves, you pool your resources, and sharing, where actually the risks are shared on a collective basis, and individuals, and this is a challenge for the CDC, when individuals are able to opt out of a CDC system, it makes the efficiency of it much more difficult to achieve, because you need those very long time periods, the confidence which the administrators of the scheme have that those people will stay in the scheme because the calculations are made on that basis. So I would describe it as a distinction between pooling and sharing risks.
And collective defined contribution is the acronym that we're talking about. So we need to be very clear on all of that.
Just to add, if you're reading the bill, they're calling it collective money purchase benefit schemes.
Yeah.
To make that.
We even lose the acronym? Okay, right, well, there we go. And then there's actually another question here about, do we think that CDC will actually help in some of those longer term care needs as well? Is it something that CDC could help us with?
I think it gives more of so you have a target income, so more of an understanding of your income, but unlike DB in CDC, your income could go down, so those target incomes could reduce. So whilst it does give you a kind of an expectation of what you could get, there is some complexity around that. So it's kind of between that DC and DB. So potentially could help members a little bit more with their planning, but there is still risks here.
I mean, I think one of the features that will probably come up repeatedly when we talk about this is in keeping with the way that a lot of bills and legislation are being done in pensions arena, it's primarily enabling. So a lot of the detail that people are asking questions about here, I think the only honest answer at this point is it could, because I don't think it's sought to be prescriptive enough that we can give all the answers to that. I mean, there are some key features, obviously, that we've already covered about the fact that it's collective, the fact that the benefit can change. So arguably, it could incorporate things like social care needs, but I don't think that's a primary purpose at this stage.
Mm-hmm. Great, well, good discussion on CDC, and thanks for feeding in the questions as well. Please keep those coming, clarification or any other questions that you want to send in. So let's move on now, panel, to the dashboard. So the bill will compel pension schemes to provide data to the non-commercial money and pension service dashboard and to other private sector dashboards if they're set up. Now, do you think that pension dashboards do really have the ability to transform engagement? What might be the challenges for schemes with providing data to the dashboard? So, Nicola, I think you were going to start us off on this one.
Yeah, so thank you. So all of us must welcome the provision of the dashboard and the fact that it has that cross-party political backing behind it. It's very important. So this morning we were talking about the 23% of people that think they know what they need to live on in retirement, but probably if you were to ask those people, do they actually know how much they've got towards that at the moment? I suspect that many of them wouldn't. And it's good that it's going to be non-commercial. I think that's really important. We were also talking yesterday about cybercrime. So, clearly the level of protection of that vast quantity of member information is going to be absolutely key. The PLSA is very keen in all the discussions that we've had and with the stakeholders that the state pension gets included. Because for many, many scheme members in all types of schemes, that state pension is a massive contribution to that overall pot. I mean, I think we saw the minimum standard pension broadly 10,000. So if the state pension, if people are eligible for full state pension, is about 8,000 of that. So it puts them on the way. So that seems to be critical. But the two areas I'd quite like to talk about is, the first one is data. Now, we talked quite a lot about data yesterday. But what we have no clue about at the moment is what format, what it's got to look like, how much data. And, you know, we were just having a little chat earlier where we could be looking for people coming up to close to retirement, 40 years worth of records with potentially, I think the average is 7 to 9 different employers. Those records will be in all different formats. I mean, we know there are some legacy DB schemes where the pension scheme in effect sits in a cupboard. And there could well be a lawyer somewhere that may well be the sole trustee who may or may not be operating. We know of many schemes where they still hold old data on microfiche. So the bit I'd like to very quickly focus on in my final couple of minutes is I want to talk about scheme administration, because data is all about the quality of scheme administration. And I know, we all know, that actually on most trustee boards, scheme administration is not a main part of the agenda. Now, investment is clearly important because we need to earn enough money on those investments to actually pay pensions. But the administration of the scheme to those scheme members is so critical. And administrators will say they struggle to get an item on the agenda. And it's also, for any trustees out there, you're going to have to start spending some real money on administration to be able to make sure that we are able to extract all this data. Because multiple employer schemes, a scheme like my own, the local government pension scheme, has 17,500 employers who also have all sorts of data issues. So I think that would be my main plea, that we've got to, trustees love to discuss investment. We all love to discuss investment because it's all very exciting. But actually, if you say to trustees, we need to do something with our investment and it's going to cost £1 million or the fees are going to go up, everybody says, yes, but the investment will be so good. If you go to a trustee board and say, we want to spend £1 million on digitalising some data, they'll just look askance in most cases. So I think it's a mindset.
Yeah, well, certainly we did hear a lot about data yesterday as well. I think it's a really important fact.
Really important.
Yeah. Carol, did you want to add something there?
Well, yeah, from the DB Policy Committee, this is something that we debated, and I think it is important to keep emphasising, because we are talking a little bit about some of the challenges. That's because we're already so committed to making it work. It's not that anyone thinks this is a great idea. It's absolutely what we want to have in place, and I think the engagement that will come with having a fully functioning dashboard is something worth shooting for. But we want to avoid unintended consequences. So I think there is the point around, particularly as we want to have DB schemes on there, that we're going to have to be realistic about the time frame in which that will be possible for all schemes. And we should just be figuring out how we work towards that. But the other thing that we discussed in some depth at the DB Policy Committee, and we don't know the answer to yet, is how defined benefit data is going to be shown. Because are you going to show it as because everything else is, we think, going to be shown as a pot. So are we going to start quoting transfer values? Are there unintended consequences of that? Is there going to be a way to share the relevant amount of information around what people might be giving up if they transfer? So it's a really important part, but there'll be some important practical considerations and some, particularly from DB members' perspective, some important safeguarding considerations about how that data is shown, particularly if we think people might start to act on it.
So I just added, and it's the scale. 6,000 DB schemes, most of which, of course, will be legacy schemes now, and 50,000 DC schemes. It's a huge scale.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Got some fantastic questions coming on the dashboard, so I'll deal with those. So I really love this one, so I'll read it out. So a dashboard with an alignment to the retirement living standards and potentially the advice that you get from the Money and Pension Service feels like a real game changer for mass pensions engagement. Are we finally cracking the engagement dilemma? So that's a nice positive comment. Let's go on to some of the other questions, though. Do the benefits of the dashboard project outweigh the cyber risks of valuable data falling into the wrong hands? That's one that I do hear quite a lot discussed around dashboard. So
I hope I'm not going to misquote him, but I had the benefit of hearing Chris Curry talk about some of this, and Chris, mea culpa if I get any of this wrong. But one of the things that I think is perhaps misunderstood about how they're envisaging that the dashboard will work is it's not going to be a big database sitting somewhere that people can go and query. It's almost going to be something that reaches out, takes the information, presents it to the individual, and then is gone. Now, there are different things about record keeping and what have you, but I was reassured when I heard him speak about that serious thought is being given to that point, I think. That's great. And then another interesting question here, would the panel rather see a dashboard rolled out promptly
but containing only, say, 50% of a member's pension records? Or is it better to wait 7 or 8 years, says the question, and include nearly all the arrangements? Thoughts on timing?
So I think it depends what's missing. So I think to go without state pension, for example, or to go without some of the really big high value things, there will always be a sort of cost-benefit analysis to be done. Personally, I don't think it'll sit at 50%, but to some of the challenges that Nicola and I have already highlighted, for these, small schemes with a handful of members who need, should we wait for the time it will take to get absolutely all of that on? I mean, many people will be in organisations that are looking to embrace agile methodology. I don't think I'm quite arguing for an MVP, a minimum viable product, but I do think there's something about that mindset that says that we should be trying to get something out that's substantially ready and not waiting till it's perfect.
So I think I would say, I'm sure if you asked most members of the public, not the people in this room, although that would be interesting, they'll have no idea even what the state pension is. I think people are quite unrealistic about what the state pension is, and we've kind of got to start somewhere. I also think that the comment that was made about relating it to the living standards and that being a major breakthrough is really important, because the living standards will be highlighting to people what it is they need. But as we know, most people haven't got a clue what they've got. Yeah. So even to start it, even if it starts with the state pension, that in itself is an indicator to them.
It really is.
At the moment,
a combo could be so valuable, I think. And then there's a question specifically for you, Greg, along these same lines. So you said that charges should be on the dashboard from the start, but with no standard definition of charges, schemes struggling with data, as we've heard from the panel, is that going to be a delaying factor for the dashboard? Does it have to be there? Back to this sort of timing versus what we're going to have on the dashboard question.
Yeah, I think delays in the dashboard are two words that go very closely together for good reasons. The prize of a dashboard of a single site where everyone can see their pension pots and accruals is a very significant advance, but the challenges in getting there are enormous for data reasons, but also for broader reasons. I thought it's striking and worth picking up upon. The Pension Minister noted the consensus between the two major parties and more broadly in Parliament in support of the bill. But at the same time, Jack Dromey, the Labour Party's pension spokesperson, also said yesterday that Labour will be arguing for a single public dashboard as opposed to a single public dashboard and multiple versions. And I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in Parliament. It's worth noting this bill isn't going to be passed anytime soon. The government has a majority of -40 in Parliament. There's going to be a general election one way or another, imminently. But before there's an election, we might get to discussion of the bill in Parliament, and I think that will be really interesting. Does the consensus hold up on that pension dashboard element of the bill? Because Labour's concerns, I suspect, will be the danger of creating a Trojan horse where we're all talking about a single source of truth where individuals can see all their pots and accruals. But there's lots of commercial entities out there for their own good reasons and in their own context who want to make dashboard a selling tool, and the public's very clear from all survey data that it doesn't want to be sold to. And I think beyond the data, that's where the granularity, when you get beyond dashboard as a good idea, will really start to play out. For occupational pension schemes represented in this room, I think there's a big challenge of ensuring that the more powerful, stronger protections for consumers that exist in the workplace pension scheme are transferred into any broader dashboard environment if we get to a stage where selling via consolidation tools is possible. Think about it, workplace pensions, heavily regulated, charge cap and auto-enrolment, governance strong. Retail pensions lack those same protections, generally speaking. So beyond the data, beyond, I think, the political differences that will begin to emerge on dashboard, I think there's that fundamental question of how do we ensure that people who are in occupational protection schemes, your members, are protected appropriately as we move into potentially a more open environment. And I think that's going to be a big challenge.
Thanks, Rick. So lots of questions were coming through about cyber security, which I think we've covered to a certain extent. The real importance of having the state pension on the dashboards coming through. I'll just sort of round this off with one comment here. So someone's saying, I had a client who had pensions with 27 different providers. Collating the aggregate value was a nightmare. The dashboard would have made it simple. So let's move on from the dashboard now to our third topic, which is TPR powers and the DB regime. So the bill does provide extra powers to TPR to investigate, gather information, and also increase the criminal sanctions there as well for deliberate wrongdoing by the sponsor and others. And also DB schemes, are going to be asked to make more statements here as well. So can I just get a view from the panel of, what's your view of those new powers for TPR, and what do you think about some of these new requirements?
So in my view, actually, I think TPR powers and increasing them is actually really positive. I mean, the Minister just said it about high-profile cases such as BHS that I think do damage confidence in savers. I mean, in this room, we know that quite a lot of the pension schemes are run quite well. But I know from doing focus groups with DC members that they read those news headlines, and it really does damage trust in pension providers. So I think it's really important to have additional powers in this area for the TPR. So I'm really quite supportive on the fines and the additional things. But I think really the devil is going to be in the detail around this. So there's some additional points within the bill kind of around statements of intent around corporate activities and exactly what the TPR is going to require in that area, because obviously we don't want anything that the TPR is doing to kind of jeopardise things such like refinancing deals with corporates, for example, which could ultimately get the corporate to go under, and obviously that's very detrimental from a member's perspective. So I think overall, really positive on the additional powers, but I think we just need to see exactly, actually, as the bill plays out, what actually the detail underlies it is.
Yeah, and I think from the DB committee's perspective, I would echo all of that. I think it's no one in this room, I imagine, is going to argue against the TPR having appropriate powers to be able to go after the small minority of cases where we see there's been deliberate bad intent or criminal activity, and the fact that they'll have additional teeth to put behind their sort of clearer, quicker, tougher piece is something that I think everyone absolutely will welcome. I think the thing that many scheme sponsors and DB scheme trustees have thought was a really strong, powerful aspect of the existing framework, though, is the ability still to look at scheme-specific funding. I think that's a feature that generally has been held to be pretty positive. And so the devil is always in the detail in terms of the policy, but the devil is also in the implementation and how that policy is implemented and how the TPR will look to use the powers that they have. And so I think that there'll be a little bit of nervousness that we're not going to move to lowest common denominator regulation, and that for the schemes and the scheme sponsors who want to, really sustainably and responsibly fund their schemes, that they're not going to end up spending too much of their limited governance time in angst about whether they're going to fall foul of some new term that they don't fully understand. I will confess, even though I'm up here, that I don't carry the absolute wording of all the current bills and guidance in my head. But what I did pick up, and I wrote down, was that the Minister for Pensions talked about this language of willful and reckless. And I think there will be significant amounts of interest in even amongst the responsible corporates, and I would argue also amongst trustees, about what are things that, with the benefit of hindsight, might be deemed to be willful and reckless. And is it going to be just the interpretation of that we would all feel, we could understand, or is there the risk for some sort of hindsight application of things that might have been taken in good faith? So all that will really do, I think, from a DB perspective, is continue to up the ante on the importance of documenting not just the decisions you've taken, but why you've taken them and what things you've taken into account as you move through that. The other aspect that I think will get a bit of interest, Emma, is that quite understandably, given where DB schemes are in their life cycle, there is a lot of focus on end game and long-term targets, and we've seen that the bill continues to probably want to emphasise some of that, or certainly some of our discussions with regulators as they were moving towards this emphasised that would be very much in their mind. And I think we all agree that would be part of just good long-term planning for pension schemes. But again, the devil is in the implementation, and there are certain industries and certain firms, depending on what their scheme rules say, we have to start thinking about the interaction of this good intention to state what your long-term funding target might be, and how that can actually play for a corporate into what they have to disclose in their accounts, and for capital requirements businesses, what capital they have to hold against that. They're actually really, really important matters, and these are things that responsible employers might well want to engage with, but find difficult to make firm commitments on. So it will all be in the implementation, and I've no doubt that the TPR will want to continue that discussion.
And actually, there's a really interesting question on that almost turns this sort of the other way around. It says, is it realistic to expect TPR to actually have the resource and capacity to deliver on its increased responsibility? Are they being set up to fail? I mean, we probably all feel a bit of that.
I think there's a session tomorrow with David Fears and Joe, wasn't there, tomorrow morning? So that's a good question to store up for then and ask them directly.
We'll do that. Nicola,
Well, just on previous discussions we've all had with the TPR, it's great they get given new powers or whatever, but they're not always enabled very well to exercise that. Yeah. They don't always, as a public sector body, get given the budget they need. And their staff are in a no different position to all of us. They will have only read the bill. Mm-hmm. Of course they'll have read the bill, overnight, the 100 pages, and yet they're going to be expected to have a view and an opinion and be able to start to talk to schemes about it. So I think it's that was a really good question.
It was.
We'll ask tomorrow.
Yes. And let's move on, because actually there's a lot to cover in this session, isn't there? So let's move on to the transfer point. So there is a really important provision within the bill to allow schemes to protect members from the possibility of transferring out of their pension scheme into a potential scam. So there's new legislation tightening where the transfers can be sent. So broadly, to an FCA-regulated scheme, to a master trust, or a scheme with a sponsoring employer where the employment link has been proven by the saver. So what do we think about these new ideas around transfers?
I think we've touched on this already throughout the conference so far, but in my view, we need more protections here for members. So this is really positive. I think accessing, transferring your pensions is really complex, and it's like trying to navigate Spaghetti Junction. We don't want people to go down the wrong turning here and ultimately end up in a scam. So as Margaret Snowden was saying yesterday, the more we can do up front to make people not take that wrong turn and end up in a scam and end up losing their pension is a really positive thing from my perspective. So I think really trying to put this legislation in place is really important. Having those extra checks in place in this legislation is important. Even though it's a small bit in the bill, I think it's probably one of the most important pieces. So I'm really positive about this area.
So it's not clear how it will apply to the public sector schemes, as these things never are, because of course we have our own regulator, which is MHCRG. But it's just worth noting that at conferences like this, we kind of put the public sector DB scheme membership aside because, it's a cause, as we all know, of consternation. But, there are 5.8, probably 5.7, 5.8 active DB members of those public sector schemes. So, it is very significant. And you would think, well, if you were in a public sector scheme, we all know that the press says these gold-plated schemes, but in my own scheme, the local government scheme, average pay 17,500, average pension is about 5,000. But what is interesting, you'd think if you were in what is classed, and it still is in the deep, it is still gold-plated compared to what most people now have access to. But you'd be astonished at the number of people that want to transfer out. Mm. Yeah. And the reason they want to transfer out is because they want to have access through freedom and choice to the money, which they are not able to in any of the public sector schemes. So I hope that some of it does apply to us, because we genuinely have so many issues around the scams and the potential cybercrime, and the amount of approaches individuals in public sector schemes are now getting. We can do this for you, we can do that for you, you will have access to this pot of money. I think it's just very serious. And the only other thing I wanted to mention, which applies to all of us, I think, is financial advice, because in our scheme, before we could transfer somebody, we have to sign off to say that we've seen the certificate that somebody's taken financial advice. But I know that administrators look at these and they're thinking, my goodness, I just think, what is this person thinking? What on earth are they doing transferring out of the scheme? But of course you can't question it or whatever. And I think there's a real issue about the specialist quality of financial advice, where you get it from, because most schemes don't actually recommend a financial advisor. They direct people to a list of regulated financial advisors. And I think, and the cost, for scheme members, £1,000 to pay for a proper financial advice is a huge ask.
Yep.
But clearly that's exactly what they need. So I'm not giving a solution here. I'm just throwing a few issues into.
Yeah. I think it's important that we do think about the risks and those points about financial advisor. We talked a lot about scams and doing more there. We're talking about the dashboard earlier. Yeah. It's just there's going to be more and more transfers, and it's kind of getting this right now and getting the policy in place is just really key to protect members. I think this is such a big risk, and I'm glad it's been focused on.
Right, well let's move on to the final bit, which is things that are not in the bill. So I think, we could probably make a long list, but the ones that we were really going to focus on are nothing about DB super funds, nothing about removal of the lower earnings limit, actually nothing about net pay. I'm sure the list could go on, but just in the final few minutes that we've got for this discussion, I wonder if the panel would like to comment on the things that weren't in the bill.
The auto-enrolment review pledges from government, I think you suggested there, Emma, are an obvious omission. Now, this is a pension schemes bill rather than a pensions bill, so technically you can't include auto-enrolment legislation in the bill, but of course that's a political choice by the government to confine it to pension schemes. Government accepted, elements of the 2017 review. I think most master trusts take the view, all master trusts, that making contributions from the first pound, broadly speaking, would be a significant advance in the system. I would add personally, beyond the remit of the Master Trust Committee, I think taking the earnings limit down to the primary national insurance threshold of £8,500 would bring in 500,000 more low earners, 3/4 of whom would be women. And I think that's very important because of the 5 million of the workforce who aren't auto-enrolled because they're below the threshold, the trigger. The vast majority, or certainly a significant majority, are women, because women tend to be in low-paid roles, part-time roles, multiple jobs. I think that's going to be an area of focus going forward for auto-enrolment, and a nice place to start would be to legislate along the lines that the government recommended. I'm certainly aware, and colleagues in the Master Trust Committee are aware of the challenges the government faces. There are people for whom putting more into their pension is in tension with living their everyday life and paying the bills. I do think further research needs to be done on the differential impact of increasing contributions and the various ways you can increase contributions. But a nice start would be to bring the primary national insurance threshold, make that the basis as the earnings trigger, and bring in 500,000 more savers.
Do you want me to talk about super funds?
Yes, please.
Consolidators? I mean, the pragmatist in me says that a lot of what's not in this bill, as Greg's already touched on, is just political expediency. They've gone for the things, and I think that's actually quite sensible. There were a number of things that we would really like to get through if they can, and so the things that appear to have the biggest cross-party support are in there. I don't think it's necessarily the case that there isn't cross-party support for the consolidators, but what I wouldn't think is that we need to leap from it's not in there, therefore it's not a thing that's happening. There's been an awful lot of very sensible and in-depth discussion about how these things might work that would lead me to believe that it's not in there now, but that doesn't mean that that's not something that would develop. I think as and when that does develop, there are people far more expert than I am in parliamentary procedure, but I understand there's also possibilities around second readings of bills and things that could come in or out. And I think that if we get to that point on consolidators, it will just, all of the focus then I think will fall on is it going to be a pensions-like regime or is it going to be an insurance-like regime? And how are we going to walk that sort of tightrope between appropriate amounts of security and safeguarding and not killing a fledgling industry stone dead? They'll be the debates as and when they come. So I don't think the absence now is indicative of there being nothing to follow, would be my... there's no inside information there, whatever the government equivalent is. That's just my personal view.
And maybe there's a wider question for the industry, that the consolidation, when we're thinking about it, it's about a sponsor being able to transfer its obligations. But maybe we could, despite it not being built, just start to think of some of the areas that around that potential consolidation. So everybody talks about the public sector and the local government pension scheme, particularly in terms of pooling, as if we've done some massive consolidation in the scheme, but actually the only bit that we've really brought together is pooling some assets. Mm-hmm. So the government 4 years ago now gave us the enviable task, you will think, of finding like-minded funds, well, whatever that means, like-minded, and there was 100 to choose from, and we had to form, I think the initial thought was 6 pools, it ended up being 8, and together we had to have assets of about £25 billion. Well, there was no scientific way to do this, which you could almost see reflected into the wider DB consolidation. And I'm mindful of a discussion there was yesterday, it was Bill Galvin actually, and he talked about the culture and DNA of organisations. And I mean, that's going to be so critical in whatever happens, because the culture of pension funds, pension schemes and sponsoring organisations is just so widely different. And I won't get into a discussion about asset pooling. You'll all be very glad to know, although I'm sure some members of the audience would quite enjoy that. £300 billion of assets, of course, is obviously far more interesting than admin. But the governance is the most important thing. You can always find a technical, structural way, legal way to do something, and that's what will happen. I mean, there's only 2 consolidators in the market now, but that's what will happen. People will find ways to make that work. But actually, what is absolutely critical is the governance. Who makes the decisions, how those decisions are made, who is represented, who is accountable to who, all of those things, who's accountable to the individual scheme members. It's absolutely critical, and it's the area where people tend to do that bit last. They'll think of all the technicals. It's all exciting. How are we going to get all these great big pools of assets in these DB consolidation vehicles? But actually, you've got to think about the governance.
Great. Well, thank you, Nicola. Thank you, panel, very much. So it's been a privilege to share with you kind of Policy Board live on stage during this session. I did get one little comment come through that said, congratulations on the diversity of the panel. So, Greg, thanks very much for providing that diversity for us.